Hello and good day, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. This is our second part of study of Revelation in this series of looking at the New Testament. I've done something that I have not done before, which is to split this study up on one book into two sections. The the look at Revelation last time, it was just getting a bit too long, and I realized that I was not going to be able to wrap that up in any sort of decent amount of time, and so I decided to split this up into two. Last time we talked about the historical background of Revelation, looking at who exactly wrote this, what kind of a book this is, and some things to keep in mind, what the world may have looked like when Revelation was being written, and how these things in the world affected the message that John wrote in this really amazing and completely unique book in the New Testament and certain in the Bible even. A few things about this. We're going to now transition from the historical elements of the book, kind of what's behind the text and what was the foundation of writing this text. And now this week I wanted to look at some ways that people have read this book and some messages that people have gotten and some things that we can get out of this. One thing to remember is that with Revelation, it's very easy to get lost in the weeds. Sort of, there's a lot of imagery, just rapid fire imagery coming at you. And like I said, this book is unique. If you haven't read through this a lot, this is something that's completely strange and can be very terrifying even. And so it's very easy to get lost in some of these images and to start thinking about this as some kind of secret to be deciphered. People have thought of this as kind of a roadmap to history. And then what I feel like sometimes we end up doing, especially as Adventists, we start to try and decode what these messages are so that we can get a sense of what's coming. You try and find out where we are in this book, where we are in history, and then what is to come, so that we can get a preview and we can know what's happening. And the danger to that, I think, is that we're seeking some kind of control, right, over our lives, over history, to know what is coming, and so that we'll be prepared for it, and we'll know exactly what to do when these next things happen. And the problem with this is that I don't think Revelation is written for that. I don't think that this is a preview of history. I don't think that this is a roadmap. It does talk about some future things, and I think it does address kind of our world and our future, but in very broad strokes. I think the message of this book is not we can predict the future or we know exactly what is going to happen in the next few days, months, or years, but rather it's the same message that the Bible overall has been giving believers throughout history. And that is, you need to trust in God, whatever comes. And really the message of Revelation is, yes, you need to trust in God. God has control of this. And whatever happens in the future, whatever happens in our lives, we need to trust God. And not only that we need to trust God, but that God is trustworthy. In Revelation, it's a couple of times in Revelation, it comes right out and says, these are the words of the one who is trustworthy and true. These words themselves are trustworthy and true. You can, in fact, trust God. And that is something that we need to do throughout all of the disasters that we might see, throughout all of the intense things that we might be going through in our lives, in the history of this country, where we are right now, any kind of future calamities or challenges that we might face. Revelation points to the fact that God is trustworthy, and that we know that, hey, if we're on this plane, there's going to be turbulence. We don't know how exactly to fly the plane or where even we are going, but we can trust the plane to get us there. not only is the plane trustworthy, but I think that it also says something about God, that's important for us to remember, and that is that God loves us. God is not only trustworthy and reliable, but that God in fact loves us, that our lives matter to God. The lives of God's people matter to God very much, and that's something that you will see repeatedly in this book is just God's passion for the people. Even as God's people are suffering, even as God's people are going through some real hardships and some really scary stuff, God's passion for us, it really comes through. And so it's like, it's not only saying that the plane that's getting us to our destination is trustworthy and will get us there, but in fact that we know who is flying the plane. This is not some kind of autopilot. This is not some mechanical thing that, you just get on this and it's going to take you there. No, we know, in fact, who is flying the plane, and it is God who loves us. The introduction to Jesus in chapter 1, to the one who loved us and saved us from our sins by his blood. So the one who is piloting us, the one who's going to get us there, is one who loves us and cares about us. It's like the pilot of the plane is our mother or our father, who is not only trustworthy, but who cares about us, and who, in fact, when you think about Jesus, who laid down his own life for us, to get us on this plane, to give us some kind of hope that we will be able to get there, and that hope will not fail us. These words, these promises here are trustworthy and true. So that's something to remember, as we go through this book and as we look at ways that this book has been read. And I'm not going to get into the specifics. We're not going to be talking about, what do the 7 trumpets mean? What do, these beasts mean? Although I do, I'm going to look at a case study about one of the beasts and what that means. But we're not going to really look in depth as to, the 4th trumpet, 5th trumpet, 6th trumpet, where are we in this series and what does this mean? I'm not going to get too much into that. You can read that on your own, and we might come back in later Bible studies and revisit this. But I'd recommend that everybody read this book through, but to, certainly go through this presentation and look at some ways that people have read this, some ways that people have gotten meaning out of this. And then when you read this book, read the book in light of some of these overarching themes that are running throughout really the entire book, and even some of the kind of works that have inspired it. And see if that changes, the way that you read it when you read it through, and some of the messages that you get from this. So yeah, let's go on now and have a look at themes of Revelation, ways to read this book, and some ways that people have gotten meaning out of this book that has been very mysterious and interpreted in all sorts of ways throughout history, but is grounded in a certain message, and is looking, in fact, not to confuse us or to hide things from us, but to reveal things to us about Jesus and God, and what God exactly thinks of us, and how God feels towards us, and what God's plan is for us. Now, moving then from the historical setting of Revelation, here are 4 ways that Revelation has been interpreted and read. Okay, and these are going to get kind of technical, but if you look at a commentary, a modern commentary on Revelation, you'll probably run into these terms. 4 major ways that Revelation has been interpreted over the years. The first one is called the preterist. In Spanish, I think there's a preterist or preterito, kind of a tense, and it means past tense. Okay, and so this preterist is referring to people who think that everything that was written in Revelation, what happened in the past. Revelation is only a product of its time. It speaks only to events that were happening as it was being written. When John was writing this, he had no conception that this would be future stuff. Okay, and when he says things like, these are things that are yet to come. This is future. It's kind of from the perspective of his own time. And, this is going to be stuff that happens in the near future, or it's the sense of this is promised to happen and it's for sure to happen. But really, when John was writing, he had no sense that we would still be here 2,000 years later. Nothing that he's writing is referencing stuff that is happening, say, today. All right, and so everything that he's writing is written to people back then. It would have been relevant to them. It would have been meaningful to them back then, and he had no conception that this would be used in future times to kind of predict what would happen. This is probably the perspective of most religious scholars now. This is something that was written then. It had meaning then, and we're now studying it. We can study it, but this is not like a prediction of stuff that we're seeing today. The second thing there is the historicist perspective. This is what has traditionally been the Adventist interpretation of Revelation, and that is that Revelation, it provides kind of this roadmap to the way that history would unfold in the years after Revelation, and it kind of takes us through this grand tour of history, and we see historical things that are going on. We see the various empires rise and fall, and then there's the section kind of towards the end, of course, that is still to come, but that will be fulfilled like right before Jesus comes. But really, most of the book is talking about stuff that has happened, but John was providing sort of this overview of history for us so that we could believe, and we could kind of know that, in our time is very short, and we need to get our act together, and we need to really get the message out to other people that Jesus is coming soon. Of course, that's been, in our DNA as Seventh-day Adventists from the beginning, and so, of course, we would interpret Revelation in this way. Any kind of sermons, traditional Bible studies from Adventists have been this historicist view. The next one is called the futurist view, and this is saying that everything that Revelation describes is happening in the very, very far future. It's kind of a description of what will happen right before the end of time. Most American evangelical churches interpret the book in this way. It's one reason why politically Israel is so important, because your evangelical churches, they believe that Israel is going to have a very important role in right before Jesus comes, and actually after Jesus comes. They of course believe in a secret rapture, where Jesus takes all of the believers away, and rather than kind of a physical second coming, there's this secret rapture, and then what's left is this kind of all of the evil people, and there's this time of tribulation and things. I won't go too much into that, but that is how they interpret this. And so all of these things, the plagues and everything, are happening either right before the secret rapture or kind of afterwards, when all of the saints are in heaven, and so now just judgment is just being poured down on the earth. If you have any kind of dialogue with non-denominational churches, evangelical churches, this is how they would interpret this book and how they see kind of the end of time. The last one there is called the idealist view, and this one is kind of picking up steam in the last few years. This says that Revelation is not so much a roadmap to history, but it is kind of this ideal view, or it presents these universal ideas and truths, these universal themes that are applicable in every single time, and kind of reveal what God is doing in the world at every time, the way that believers should live and understand their place in history. But it is less kind of a roadmap or a specific description of what's happening, but rather, this kind of general call to be faithful, to understand that God is working even when things are bad, and that, we need to choose to be on God's side, and that's a message that it has to every time. All right, so those are your four ways of interpreting this book, and you can see, you can find yourself on this continuum. If you were to ask me how I interpret Revelation and how I preach this book, I am a preterist in the sense that I do believe that Revelation was written to people during that time. It would have made sense to the people that received it. They would not have been sitting there going, I don't know what's happening here. This must be fulfilled later, kind of a thing. No, this spoke very directly and very vividly to what was happening in their lives. But I hesitate to say that's all it was. Okay, and I tend to then go towards the idealist view and try to find, what are the general themes that this book then reveals to us? How does Revelation tell us how to live? And now I'm going to go into a case study, a specific case study, that might explain why I interpret this book in the way that I do. Okay, and that is this element in Revelation, this image in Revelation of this mark of the beast, or a number of the beast. In Revelation chapter 13, it describes a time when one of these beasts that comes up and is serving Satan, this beast takes control of the world, seemingly of governments and economies, and it makes it impossible to buy or sell unless you have a mark on you. And then Revelation goes on to say that anybody who has understanding, try and figure this out, because it is actually a number, and it's the number of a person. Okay, and so there in Revelation 13:18 it says this number is the number of a person, and his number is 666, infamous number and symbol in Christian thought, right? So I'm going to go through now the four different schools of thought on Revelation and how they interpret this image, okay, or this number. So for a preterist, remember, these people believe that Revelation was only applicable to the time that it was written, and so therefore this refers to a person who was active or powerful during that time. Something that scholars have noticed is that if you take a title for the Emperor Nero, remember I mentioned him before, you take his name and title and you write it in Hebrew. So Caesar Neron is how it would be pronounced, and this would add up to 666. The Jews have all kinds of ways of numbering and, these complicated systems of numbers and letters and all of those things. You take that, and this adds up to 666. There are textual variants. In other words, there are Greek manuscripts where Revelation 13:18 doesn't say 666, it says 616. And some other people have noticed that if you write Caesar Nero instead of Caesar Neron, that adds up to 616. And so maybe they were going on this variant, and so they wrote it down as 616. There are some inscriptions that are written to Emperor Domitian. If you remember, most people think that Domitian was the emperor during Revelation's writing. And we found some inscriptions dedicated to Domitian where the letters add up to 666. Okay, so this, for a preterist, this was kind of a code for the emperor, either the emperor during that time or the emperor that was pretty much universally reviled as the worst person, the most evil person to ever occupy that office. Okay. And so people during this time who maybe were under persecution or being tempted to compromise their faith, they would have seen this and understood, the beast that works against God is the emperor and everything that the emperor represents. All right, going on now, we have the historicist view, and again, this is where a lot of traditional Adventist interpretation comes from. This would look for a prominent figure in church history, and depending on who you ask, different denominations will identify this differently, but certainly to early Adventists, the figure that they kind of settled on very quickly was the Pope. Okay, and not just one pope, but certainly the office of the pope as it developed throughout history. Of course, yeah, we don't think very highly of the Pope and the Catholic Church because of some things that they did, most notably in Adventist thought, kind of changing the holy day of worship from Sabbath, Saturday, to Sunday, major theme throughout Adventist writings. And so, yeah, they identify the Pope with this number, saying, that, yeah, the Pope changed a lot of things, a lot of bad influences came into the church, and, yeah, the Pope ended up working against the very God that they claimed to serve. There is this supposed papal title that I have seen in Adventist literature, the papal title Vicarius Filii Dei, Vicar of the Son of God. Okay, a representative of the Son of God. And people looked at this and they said, look, if you take that title and you pull out the letters that have Roman numeral equivalents, and I've put them there, right? D is the Roman numeral for 500. You have C, which is 100. L is 50. All of those are in that title. There are two V's, even though one of them is hiding. The first letter of the title, Vicarius, right there is a V. But then the other one that's hiding is the U. U is written as a V in Latin inscriptions. And so you have those two V's, one V and one U. You take those two and they equal 10. So V is 5 and times 2 is 10. And then you add up all of the I's and there are 6 of those. So add all those numbers together, and what do you come up with? 666, right? So, yeah, and so we've said, look, the Pope calls himself this, and this was inscribed on his crown, and therefore the Pope is the Antichrist because his number is 666. One problem. Catholic sources, of course, Catholics became aware of this, and official Catholic sources have pointed out this has never been used as an official title for the Pope. This was used, but the document that called the Pope this was pointed out to be a forgery. And in spite of all of these allegations and attempts to find an image of this title is not inscribed on any of the papal tiaras, okay, the kind of crown that the Pope wears. There have even been early Photoshop, it's not Photoshop, but people kind of put that into photos to kind of prove that it's there, but then those were shown to be fakes. So, yeah, just be aware that this is, at the very least, under a lot of, there's a lot of skepticism around this particular claim, this particular title. Now, what I'm not saying is that this does not mean that the Pope is the Antichrist. Okay, I'm just saying that we cannot use that particular way of argument. Okay, this is not kind of this gotcha that we can definitively pin on the Pope using those numbers. Okay, but yeah, certainly when you look at the activities of the Catholic Church throughout history, there were some very dark times. The Inquisition, the colonization of the New World. Yeah, a lot of activities would have been, described as anti-God and anti-Christ. So we have a lot of things to talk about there. A lot of ways that we can kind of criticize and, call for, deeper introspection on the part of the Pope and leadership. But yeah, maybe not using that title and that particular edition. All right, next one. This one gets kind of fun. The futurist view looks for when I say contemporary figure, that means like now, okay, like during our time, whatever time you are in, you're looking for a figure that is active or seemingly rising at your time, or a figure in the future. And this is going to be the person who bears this number of the beast and who would become the Antichrist. This person, of course, then would take over the world kind of right before the end of time and would be the one to lead this final rebellion against God. Now, here's the problem with this is if you are really subscribed to this view, you're going to be looking at a lot of different people. And a lot of people then fall into this category, and it pretty much becomes anybody that the interpreter doesn't like. Whoever's politics, policies, personality, kind of attributes, somebody isn't like, they become then the obvious bearer of this number. During my time, and I was born in 1976, so 1976 to the present, I have heard this figure. These people have all been identified as certainly being the Antichrist. Okay, and because of various things. Okay, you got Henry Kissinger, Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev, Ayatollah Khomeini, Michael Jackson, the entertainer singer, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Bono, the lead singer of U2, Oprah Winfrey, the famous talk show host, and then you get into Barack Obama, Tom Cruise, the actor, Bill Gates, Donald Trump. I'm sure people can fill in the blanks. There are a lot more people who, would have been identified as this. Again, pretty much it becomes whoever, the interpreter doesn't like. Okay, if the person is American, it's going, in the 80s it was Gorbachev because he was leading the USSR, who were the empire kind of opposing us. As Americans, you got Ayatollah Khomeini, who was, the fiery, most vocal leader of Islam, and these enemies of the state become then the Antichrist, and then you see all these presidential names, right? If you're a Republican, it's going to be Clinton was the Antichrist, or Obama was the Antichrist. If you're a Democrat, it's going to be George W. Bush, Donald Trump, okay? And so, it almost becomes, impossible to really pin this down, because you have whoever is just reading this book and giving the Bible study is going to be identifying whoever they don't like. Now here's something that I heard when I was growing up, and that was that Ronald Reagan certainly was 666. Ronald Reagan was absolutely the Antichrist. And there's some convincing stuff, okay? Ronald Reagan, his full name was Ronald Wilson Reagan, and so each of those names has 6 letters in it. So, 666, right? And then after his second presidential term, when he wasn't in the White House anymore, he came back to California and he moved into 666 St. Cloud Road. I think that's somewhere in like LA, the LA area. I think Nancy Reagan then, because of sensitivity to that, they changed that address, became like 668 or something like that, so people stopped harassing them about it. But yeah, people looked at that and they were like, ooh, Ronald Reagan is the Antichrist, 666 everywhere. And probably, Nancy Reagan consulting astrologers and some other things. Ronald Reagan joined forces with the Pope, right, to kind of take down the Berlin Wall, and that would have really gotten Adventists, alarm sirens going off. But yeah, despite all of that evidence, that was pretty convincing back then. Ronald Reagan has been dead for a number of years, so probably not very many people still thinking that Ronald Reagan is the Antichrist. Which, yeah, there is a really good kind of case study as to why this kind of identification is dangerous. All right, last one, the idealist view. The idealist would not say that any one person or even any one power is certainly the Antichrist. The idealist would say that there are many possible antichrists. Anybody who is doing evil, anybody who is opposed to God, then is, quote, anti-Christ, okay, anti-Jesus, anti-God. Idealists point out that the number 7 is important in the Bible and Revelation, just prophetic writings in general. 7 seems like an important number, representing perfection. Okay, it's often the number of God. And so then 6 is not quite 7. It's not perfection. It's falling short. And you put that 3 times, and it's not just bad or falling short, it's really bad. It's really falling short. Okay? And so this number 666 just means any power that is opposed to God, any power that is sinful. In some circles, and certainly this would have been recently getting steam. Okay, you're identifying this not with a person or even a country, but in these powers, these political powers, socialism, communism. If you're American, even capitalism is seen as anti-God. Colonialism, certainly. Systematic racism is in the news. All of these things are seen as various ways anti-God, and so people have been saying, these are antichrist systems that entire nations are built on, and we need to resist these things, and we need to know how they fall short, okay, and how they are active in the world. Revelation has a number of themes. We'll just go through a few of them here. I'm seeing the amount of time that I've taken, and Revelation, first of all, is focused on worship. Something really important when interpreting Revelation is that Revelation is focused on Jesus. When we're looking at Revelation, my recommendation is that we do not get focused on plagues, on persecution, on beasts and what they're doing. We should be focusing on Jesus, because first and foremost, this is a revelation of Jesus Christ, right there in Revelation 1:1. That's how the book is introduced. It ends with words from Jesus. Okay, and so it's bookended by Jesus Christ, and so focus on Jesus. I have actually told people that the way that we do evangelistic series in the church, I think, can be kind of backwards. A lot of times we bring people in by Revelation seminars and focusing on Revelation, when really what we should be doing is bringing people in with gospel seminars and focusing on Jesus. And then from the life of Jesus, then we take Revelation and we say this is how Revelation kind of amplifies those themes of the life of Jesus. Okay, so it's focused on Jesus and how we worship Jesus and how we worship God. Earthly powers in Revelation demand worship, going back to the empire, okay, emperor worship. But all of those powers are evil. All of them will fall short. They are corrupt and in service of death. They tear people down and they oppress people, every single one of them. No matter what kind of good they do in the world, no matter how powerful they are, they all fall short. The only one who is worthy of worship is God. Okay? God on the throne and the Lamb in chapters 4 and 5 are worthy of worship. Revelation, again, begins and ends with worship of Jesus, and has this scene in the throne room that kind of pushes us forward then into the discussion of Christian history. And I've put here a number of these chapters, and you can look at all of those chapters. They have extended songs praising God and worshiping God. Okay, so worship is a very important thing. Who you worship and how you worship are very important in Revelation. Second theme, revealing, unveiling. Okay, the word apocalypse has come in modern language to mean kind of this secret or, this end of the world destruction. Really, the word in Greek, it just means revealing. Okay, it has this idea of like pulling away a blanket that's covering something. The purpose of this book is to show. It's to show people what God is doing and what's going to take place because of what God is doing. Okay, the purpose of Revelation, it is not to confuse you. It's not to hide things. It's not to frighten us. Rather, it's to tell the truth. The world, leaders of the world are all going to lie to you. They're all going to have their own agendas and own promotions, but Revelation says this is the truth of what is happening and what God is doing. Finally, last theme, and this will be the last slide here, God is in control. God is ultimately in control, and God holds the key to the world. Okay, that's something that is presented right in Revelation 1. Okay, I hold the keys to death and Hades. God is in control, even of the most serious thing, okay, death in this world, right? And God holds that. Every worldly power is against God. They are all opposing God, and they all stand condemned. God has already judged them. Important thing in Adventist thought, right? The three angels' messages. And the second angel's message is, fallen, fallen is Babylon. Judgment for all of the sins of the world is certain, and these worldly powers that have so much power and are oppressing God's people are already judged for what they have done. For believers, especially believers who are suffering persecution, right now, right, we're in America, we're not undergoing persecution, but we are having a hard time. The last few months certainly have been very difficult. People who have lost loved ones, people who are suffering in sickness, there's good news here. Right? You will be vindicated. Your suffering is not forever, and your current problems, your current pain, there are rewards coming that are eternal and will completely sweep everything away. The death of Jesus is the thing that finally is the triumph of Jesus over the world. Okay, it seals God's rule over the world, and that's something that is really hit hard in Revelation chapter 5. The Lamb that was slain, and it was because of his blood that he gains victory, he gains power, all authority and might goes to the Lamb because of his suffering and death. And then finally here, this is the last word that I'll give here, even during these troubling times that we are in, when everything is so uncertain and, our country seems to be like falling apart at the seams, God's people can still act with love. We can follow the Lamb and the way that the Lamb does things. The way of the world is violence and oppression, military strength. The way of Jesus is sacrifice and the blood of Jesus. And it takes patience, it takes courage, it takes perseverance under suffering. But God's people can do those things. We have that power. First of all, because Jesus had it, Jesus gives it to us. But also because we know how the story ends. And how does that end in Revelation 21? Behold, now the home of God is with people. They will be his people. He will be their God. He will end up wiping every tear from their eyes. Okay, and so no matter what we're going through, no matter what we're suffering, we know how the story ends. And the end of the story is we win. God wins. And whoever is on God's side, you win. And you have eternal life. You have a crown that can never be taken away. All right. So that's something to remember about this book. Among all of the really frightening images and difficult things, is this good news. It's the gospel. Okay, good news. God is in control. God is working for his people. And God's people win in the end because Jesus wins. All right. So that finishes our Bible study. Thank you so much for being here with us as we took this walk through the New Testament. We looked at these books and how they speak about God and Jesus. We'll still be doing something here in this space. I don't yet know what it is, but it's been fun. I always love talking about the Bible, and I hope this has been helpful. All right, take care and join us if you can on Sabbath for our worship service, 11:10 every Saturday.